Welcome back, guys. We are currently inside the Z, shifting and making race car noises with our newly, almost completely installed CD009 transmission in a 280Z with an RB25. So I just got this thing into place yesterday, actually, playing around with the shifting, and it turns out that my math, or my calculations, worked out pretty well. It's pretty well centered here. It's a run through of all 6. The gears are really close with this shifter. I think that's just the way a CD009 is. This particular shifter, the SerialNine one, does have a reverse lockout, which is it's kind of hard to tell. But down and over. But there's no fluid in it yet. And I haven't actually tried. I did try to start the car, and it did start. I just wanted to confirm that the starter with the new flywheel, the adapter kit, and all that stuff would allow it to still start, and it does. So this shifter stick is pretty long, but I don't think it's much longer than what my old setup was, so I'm gonna try it. I've heard of guys cutting these down to make them shorter. Not sure if I'm gonna want to do that yet or not. I want to actually know how it feels driving. So I spent pretty much all day yesterday getting this transmission in place. I actually ended up having to go back to my parents' house where I was storing my engine hoist, and I had to take the engine off of the motor mounts and suspend it slightly up into the air, so this had to come off. I took the intercooler and grill off and then undid the intake pipes. I was able to leave the coolant pipes in place so I didn't have to do a coolant flush at least. And got the motor kind of up into the air and tipped back more, and then let it rest down onto the horns on the cross member, just without the bushings in place. I don't know if you can see it. There it is. So I took those bushings out and then just kind of let the engine just tip back under gravity while it was supported by the hoist. That gave me a little bit more clearance in this tunnel area. And the reason I had to do that is, you're probably not going to be able to see it from here, but that is, there's the end, so right there is the flange of the bell housing, and then the black piece in front of it, that's the adapter plate, which is about a 1/2 inch or so wide. That wasn't so much the issue, but the bell housing flange, when it's all bolted up, to me, I would say it technically sits in the engine bay. It's not actually physically in the tunnel. But while trying to make this all fit and slide the input shaft onto or into the pilot bushing, into the crank, there wasn't enough space in the tunnel for the bell housing flange to actually fit in the tunnel. So I couldn't line the input shaft up with that pilot bushing and allow it to go straight in because I needed to tip the engine back further just because there wasn't room for that flange. Now the bell housing itself, not counting the flange, actually fits. It's snug, but it does fit pretty well inside this S30 tunnel. In one of my previous videos I mentioned trimming out this area, which I did do. It's going to be very hard to see here now with this in place, but there's just a little bit of that remaining at the very top of the tunnel, but I did end up cutting, sorry for the lighting here, I did end up cutting almost all of this hump that was there. That definitely had to go, and it does give for just a little bit of clearance here on either side. Other side's a similar situation. I have these fuel lines, just some hard lines running in the tunnel here. There was barely enough room for those to clear and get the transmission in place, but it did work. Obviously everybody's fuel system is probably going to be not quite like that. It's not really the best way I could have run those, but at the time, for whatever reason, it made sense to me. I've got my new slave cylinder on. And as I said in another previous video, the RB25 slave goes on this side. CD009 is unfortunately going to be on the driver's side, which also happens to be my exhaust side. So I don't love that part, but I think it's gonna still fit with my existing exhaust setup. I don't think I'm gonna have to change anything there from what I can tell. I'll just have to think up some clever routing for the actual line. I do have the hard line already routed down to this side of the car. I just need to figure out a way to suspend this hose and get it either over or under the exhaust without actually being too close to it. And I guess lastly, for what's underneath the car, this is the McKinney mount. It's not actually bolted up yet. I do have a little bit of a spacer in there, which I'm not sure if I'm going to use yet or not. But it bolts right up to the trans, and you can see the existing holes for what I was using in the RB trans. This is just going to come back like 2 inches or so. So I'm gonna have to drill some new holes and probably just fill these ones in with a rubber grommet of some sort. Other than that, it looks like it's gonna work pretty well. This is not tight, so this might end up sitting up a little bit higher into the car than it currently does. Obviously we got like 3 inches of play right here, but like I said, nothing's tight, and I don't think I'm gonna use this little spacer, even though it's probably only like a 1/4 inch, if that. So yeah, we got that. We got the 354 diff in. I didn't really do much to clean it up on the outside because I figured someday it's going to come back out again. I'm not too worried about how that looks at the moment. But it is all cleaned out. I don't have fluid in it yet, but I don't have the axles in place yet either. So we got diff and we got trans. My next step will be to get a measurement for the new drive shaft. So I do have this just sitting here currently on the jack, or the tail supported by the jack, and it looks like the jack did sink down overnight just a little bit because I previously had this shifter assembly over the top of this just slightly. That's going to be closer to the point where it's actually mounted. So this will come up just a little bit higher. Obviously I have the center console on just for verifications for myself to make sure everything was going to work. I did have to notch the hole slightly bigger before it stopped about here, so I had to come back like about 2 inches with that hole and just open it up, squared off. I had exhaust mount bolted through a hole right here, so this corner's kind of messy looking. I just ended up moving that back about 1 inch. And I'm thinking what I'll do is just get some sort of rubber, like 1/8 inch or 16th inch piece of rubber that will just cover this whole thing. I'll make a little bracket to bolt it down and pinch it. And then this whole thing will be isolated, so I won't have noise and dust and dirt coming up into the cabin. Obviously I'll have a shift boot over this with the final assembly as well. I did have some damage to my parking brake cables with the previous fiasco, so I just have to get those back in place. Nothing too serious there, should just be quick procedure. I just had a bent piece of metal that I'll bend back and put everything back in place. Like I said, there was a little bit more trimming of that spot that the original cross member mounted to. I just opened that up slightly, and well, not slightly, I took most of it out, but I already had half of it out just to fit the RB trans. So anybody who's putting an RB25 transmission in their car already, there's not really much of any additional modification. There's no hammering, no indentations or anything to put in the tunnel. Just removed a little bit of that factory material that was left, and everything fit pretty well. And with the SerialNine shifter, I just had to notch out that hole at the top of the tunnel slightly. That allowed everything to fit. So really, as far as modifications go, the difference between making a CD009 fit and an RB25 transmission fit are almost no difference at all. So we're actually coming to some of the closing stages of this project now that the transmission is physically in the car. Obviously not bolted in yet at the cross member, but that won't take me long to do. That's a minor step because I've confirmed that the actual mount does work. So in my case, it's a McKinney Motorsports transmission mount. Disclaimer, I do think that company is now out of business. but I know there's other companies that produce mounts that claim that they'll work with a CD009, T56, or an RB25 transmission, and so far from what I can tell, that claim seems to be true, that a mount that you'd use for an RB25 would also work with a CD009 because they use the same bushing. So at this point, all I really need to do next is get my drive shaft ordered, because there's probably going to be like a 3 or 4 week lead time on that. So while I'm out here, I'm going to get the measurements for that just to confirm. I think it's going to be about a 2-inch difference from the old one, where I just need it to be slightly longer. Outside of that, I have a new set of used axles that I'm going to rebuild at least one side to replace my broken driver's side. In one of the previous videos, I seemed to make it sound like I broke the axles. I took it out. I think I worded that poorly. The axle obviously broke at the track. It wasn't me that broke it taking it out. Hi, buddy. So we've got the old stubs out of the 354 diff. So I could technically plug in the passenger side axle right now and then just rebuild one of the 2 pairs that I have sitting in the house at the moment, which is probably what I'm going to do. And at that point, really all that will be left to do is hook up my clutch line and fill the trans with fluid, fill the diff with fluid. We should be good to go. So I'm hoping that so far this series of videos has been, at the very least, a little bit helpful to anyone considering a swap like this. To my knowledge, I don't know of anybody else that has an RB25 in an S30 with a CD009. The CD009 has absolutely been done before in an S30. I just haven't heard of anybody else doing it yet with an RB swapped car. I think the main reason for that is because people tend to like the RB25 transmission. I just didn't love it all that much. I think the CD009 sounds like a better option, and I'm hoping all this work to make it happen pays off as something that I'll actually really enjoy. The next video may end up being one where we're actually driving the car. I think it's just going to depend on how long this drive shaft actually takes to get made and to show up. I may have another update video as far as starting to put things back together. I still have the air dam off the car from getting it on the trailer when we left the track with this thing all busted, and I'll have to put the exhaust back on, which mine is just one big giant piece essentially because the car's too low to have any V-bands hanging down. And I had to take the hood off to make the adjustments with the engine to get the bell housing on. Might leave that off for springtime. I pretty much say that every year if I have to take the hood off, and then it rains and I end up putting the hood on because I want to drive. But I kind of like the look without the hood. So we'll see. We'll see what I decide to do with that. I think I've pretty much covered everything I can think of. Thanks again for watching, guys. I also want to say thank you to everyone subscribed. Channel finally hit 3,000 subscribers, which is pretty crazy considering I went a very long time without uploading anything to this channel. So I appreciate you guys for always tuning in. If you're not subscribed already, hit that subscribe button. Like this video if you enjoyed it. And like I said, hopefully all this content helps out at least a couple people, even if it's one person out there looking for some information online. With forums being as dead as they are nowadays, Facebook groups have become like the only way to search stuff like this, it seems like at times. And Facebook makes for a horrible search engine as far as trying to find information on doing swaps and things with cars like this. So hopefully I provided some decent information for you guys with all this stuff. And until next time, we'll see ya. This should be a closer representation of how this will actually sit. Just slightly elevated outside of the hole that I cut. One of my major concerns with this swap was how far down the rear portion of the transmission was going to sit. And as far as I can tell, with this thing roughly mocked into place, got just a little bit of space here between the mounts and the floor, so it can come up slightly higher than what it is currently. I just don't trying to keep in mind my drive shaft angle as well. But the lowest portion of the transmission looks like it's going to be about level with the frame rails. It's kind of hard to get an angle that actually shows that, but I did put a straight edge across from the frame rails and it's extremely close. My goal is to make it so that the frame rail is at least by, even if it's a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch, at least make that be the lowest point rather than the transmission itself. I just don't want that to be the thing that bangs on the ground if I ever come out of a steep driveway or anything like that. So it's gonna be really close. It definitely sits a little bit lower than the RB Trans does, at least at that point. Other than that, I think once it's in there, I may end up with a little bit of drive shaft angle, but I think I'd rather deal with that than deal with the transmission banging on the ground and just cracking that case wide open.